Hello everyone, this is Chase Pounds. In honor of the 114th anniversary of the Titanic, I'm going to be discussing about how about 60 years ago, during the 50th anniversary, there seemed to be lack of Titanic interest and acknowledgement of the historic disaster. Now, when I was coming up in middle school, which then was the 100th centennial of the Titanic disaster, and I think that would have been my very first, I guess I should say, experiencing or witnessing or I guess recounting the marking of a historic event, a centennial, along with the Black Wall Street Massacre, the Martin Luther King 2018, the 50th anniversary of MLK's assassination, yes, and the Black Wall Street Massacre, and this year will be the 150th anniversary, of course, of the of the founding of the United States, or independence from Britain, and the establishment of our nation, 4th of July. But when I was coming up during the 100th anniversary of the Titanic, I kind of remember everything where I was, what I was doing, and what was on TV regarding the Titanic. I remember a lot of news coverage. That was really the first year I started watching the news for the first time. I usually just listen just to see what the weather was, but then I started listening to a lot of the current events and stories. One of them was about the Titanic. They were announcing the 100th anniversary. I also remember there was a lot of articles and videos on YouTube, on the internet and videos on YouTube. I remember collecting a lot of books. Collecting a lot of books on the Titanic, particularly during the 100th anniversary. Then there was the my school would always have like these book fairs, and they seem to always have a book that was devoted to the Titanic, either whether a non-fiction book or a fictitious novel about the Titanic. It seemed like every year in my library they had a new book about the Titanic, and I collected a lot of books from that. Distant Waves. One was Ghost of the Titanic, and some other books I collected, and and then there was always were all the documentaries that came on both the History Channel, National Geographic, PBS. I think that was all had documentaries about the Titanic during the 100th anniversary. Some were on at the same time, where I could probably watch them all at but eventually I'll watch them later. But at some point, then they also had the miniseries that came on ABC that was directed by Julian Fellows, director of Downton Abbey. Then there was another miniseries, Titanic: Blood and Steel, and then James Cameron. I didn't go and see James Cameron, which I already seen before already, but it was just him releasing the 1997 Titanic film with Leonardo DiCaprio and Kate Winslet, which a lot of people already seen, was already popular even before 2012 anniversary, but he just re-released it to pay tribute to the disaster. And it was those things that came to mind that I remember vividly about the Titanic anniversary. It seemed like everywhere in every form of media there was some type of representation, acknowledgement of the Titanic. Now, comparing this back to the years and many decades prior to the discovery of the wreck, and wreck going back to about the 50th anniversary, 1962, that would have been 60 years ago. It didn't seem like there wasn't as the same acknowledgement. Yeah. Now, 1962, what comes to mind of that year is many things. First, being personally to me, that was the year my aunt was born in 1962. Of course, John F. Kennedy was president. There was the year of the Cuban Missile Crisis. Killing the Mockingbird. It was the year Killing the Mockingbird was released. The film Killing the Mockingbird, starring Gregory Peck, was released. And the top song hit of 1962 was, well, some of the popular songs of the era of 1962 was Locomotion by Lou Eva. And then 1962 being the 50th anniversary of the Titanic disaster. But as I said, when it comes to talk about the 50th anniversary, it don't seem like there was much that comes to mind. Well, much significance or lack of acknowledgement of the Titanic disaster at the time period that comes to mind of the era. Now, I did do some Googling that there were like memorials that pay tribute to the anniversary of the disaster, such as at the Seamen's Church Institute in New York. There were some of the survivors, including Charles Baker, including the chief baker of the Titanic, gathered at the memorial service, including several other survivors. And interesting, this was the last noble event to feature a large number of survivors, a large gathering that hosted many of the Titanic survivors, as many in the pursuing decades would pass away in great numbers. 1962 is also what really comes to mind is that happens to be the year Captain Stanley Lord passed away, the captain of the controversial ship, the California, that supposedly was in the era around when the Titanic was sinking, and people were speculating and debate that they could have done more to try and save it if the radio wasn't turned on, if they heeded the rockets and paid attention to the rockets, which suppose they thought mistook the rockets as, because the color of the rockets being fire, I think they didn't know what this stood for, meaning distress, because distress or something like that. But people debate still that even if they did try to come to the aid of the Titanic, they wouldn't have made it in time anyway, sooner than the Carpathia. But 1962 is the year of when the captain Stanley Lord passed away, and he was always ridiculed. Well, he always seemed a lot of flack all the way up to his death of his actions that night, or what could have been done. And I think there may have been some hearings following this too, of the issue of the California, what she could have done to say the Titanic. But it's one thing that that's the main thing that comes to mind, that year of the 50th anniversary. Now there were I also Googled too, there was some news coverage and articles relating to the 50th anniversary of the Titanic. However, there was no original book, whether non-fiction, fictitious or non-fiction. There was no original book on the Titanic that came out that year, or any books at all. Though you did have mass reprints of Walter Lord's Not to Remember, which came out just a few years prior in 1955, along with his along with the infamous film A Night to Remember. The 50s really saw the era of Titanic. The 40s and 50s saw an era of Titanic films and television specials. You had the 20th Century Fox version with Clifton Webb, Barbara Stanwyck in 1953. You had, as I said, both the made-for-TV crafts, made-for-TV, and the theatrical A Night to Remember. You had Telephone Time, which featured the Titanic about Molly Brown, as she's famously known, and other such programs too relating to the Titanic. A Night to Remember, interestingly, though came out in 1958, not exactly during the 100th anniversary. The 50th anniversary. It's interesting that I think A Night to Remember should have been perfect tribute in 1962 too. And interestingly enough, the film A Night to Remember, when it premiered, it was actually around, I think, July, nowhere around April, interestingly, not around April the 14th, around the actual anniversary of the Titanic, which is a very historical, accurate film that paid tribute to the history and the passengers of the Titanic. It was really devoted film, really devoted to the historical aspects of the Titanic. But interesting, I'm not sure it's just me being being sentimental that a movie should premiere on the date of a historical event. But I feel like it should have. I think it felt more appropriate that the film should have been premiered on April the 14th, and on the year of the 50th anniversary. But I don't think people at the time were really, I guess, thinking about that. Ironically, compared to its predecessor film, the 20th Century Fox film, which came out 41 years on April the 14th of 1953, which would have been 41 years of the disaster. But yet that film was less devoted to historical aspects, interestingly. After Night to Remember, you wouldn't really have any films. The only film that would be after Night to Remember in the 1960, close to this anniversary, around the anniversary of the Titanic disaster, there was The Unsinkable Molly Brown with Debbie Reynolds, which that movie too is less devoted to the historical aspects too of the Titanic disaster. The Titanic is very brief, makes a brief appearance at the end of the movie, which all it is just stock footage from the previous Titanic films that had already came out in the 50s. From the iceberg scene is a mixture of the iceberg scene from the 1953 Titanic and the shot of the ship sinking sideways is from The Night to Remember. I think for the first time done in Technicolor. And that's pretty much it. It's nothing. As I said, after The Night to Remember, and there was no movie or television special in 1962 that came out on the centennial of the Titanic anniversary. There was no movie, interestingly, that came out, or television special. It seemed like after Night to Remember, that seemed like there would be a hiatus in Titanic films. For that matter, much of the 60s and 70s, there were hardly any films, for that matter, much of the 70s for that matter, about the Titanic. The only thing that comes to mind, as I said, is the unsinkable Molly of this era is the unsinkable Molly Brown. Then in 1967, you had the Time Tunnel, a science fiction show on, which is the main pilot, involves two time travelers that travel back on board the infamous doomed ship and try to warn the captain of the impending danger, and he doesn't listen, and the Titanic ends up sinking again. There's that, and then 1971 you had the Night Gallery. I think that was by Rod Sterling. It featured an episode where it was like called Lone Survivor, where they find a castaway in a lifeboat that spent 3 years adrift in the ocean that was supposed to get passed for the Titanic, and he's picked up by the ship. He's picked up by is the Lusitania, which is in danger of being hit by a torpedo, which it sinks too, and it repeats the cycle. You have that, which is all in the realm of science fiction. Then in 1972, the following year, you have the Poseidon Adventure, which is also directed by the Poseidon Adventure is a fictitious. And I mentioned this movie, referenced this movie a lot in many of my other videos. Is a fictitious ocean line disaster of a ship that's capsized by a tidal wave, and a group of survivors had to band together and try to fight their way out of the sinking ship. And this was directed by Irwin Allen, the same one who directed the Time Tunnel show that featured the episode The Titanic. That featured Titanic, the main pilot. And it was known that it was supposedly Irwin Allen had enthusiasm for the sea, and it supposedly had a fascination with the Titanic. You can see it in a lot of his works in film. Irwin Allen would go on to make other disaster films, including The Tower Inferno, which both the Poseidon Adventure and The Tower Inferno, in my opinion, have like Titanic elements in it, where it features hubris, arrogance, greed, carelessness. Let me start over. It features like arrogance, hubrisness, greed, carelessness, classism, always depicting women and children being saved first in the disaster, as and so forth. Those many elements that kind of put in mind the Titanic. And with the sense of these movies, he would be known as the master disaster, and would spawn an era, a wave of disaster movies of this period. And though many disaster movies are all very fictitious, some did use historical disasters like the Hindenburg, but never a film about the Titanic. As a matter of fact, I was reading a comment on Reddit, and she makes this person makes an interesting point. It says, "I'm surprised with how big disaster movies were in the 70s. There wasn't a big Titanic disaster movie, especially since the Poseidon Adventure was a huge hit." But another person comments by saying, disaster movies of the 70s were all about spectacle. They were action movies. A ship slowly taking on water didn't suit the formula. An all-star cast trying to escape from a ship that's been turned upside down by a freak wave. That's what sold tickets at that era. It makes sense. By the end of the decade, you would see a slight resurgence in Titanic in media film and television, you had the made for TV, kind of underrated, underrated, forgotten, not, I wouldn't say forgotten, but just underrated, not very as popular, SOS, British made for TV movie SOS Titanic. Then and some of the shots are from A Night to Remember too. I think. Then the following year you had the also box office. You also had raised the Titanic in 1980. That was based off a book by Clyde Cussler back in 1976. Unfortunately, this movie too was also it's kind of was a box office flop when it came out. And there was a quote saying it would have been cheaper to lower the length, raise the Titanic. It would have been cheaper to lower the Atlantic. Is a quote that one of the directors said. And I think it was this movie, particularly Raise the Titanic, which is the first film that depict the first film that really stray away from the sinking and focus on the wreck itself and trying to save it and preserve it and making predictions of what the wreck would have looked like, still being intact, despite that being really, by today's standard, being historically inaccurate, kind of dated. But I think the hype of the movie at the time may have stirred up like a fascination with trying to find the wreck to some extent. Some of the deleted stock footage sinking scene from Raise the Titanic was reused in the TV series on Voyagers, which also is a similar premise to the Time Tunnel, where people travel, where a group, two group or time travelers travel back in time trying to warn the people on the ship that the ship is going to sink, and people don't listen, and it ends up sinking again in a similar fashion. Then you had Time Bandits. Then you also had the movie Time Bandits that also featured the Titanic in that. And then a couple years later, the wreck was discovered in 1985 by Robert Ballard, I think a French oceanographic team. And when the wreck was discovered in 1985, that led back to interest and the fascination with the subject of the Titanic, where following the discovery, mass number of books were being published, along with about the Titanic and the recent discovery of the wreck, including that. And of course, the following decade, you had the 1997 film with James Cameron, and that further popularized interest in the Titanic to where we are today. And then the 100th anniversary, to where the Titanic is just a fabric of popular culture in the context of history. But that's my take on that subject about in those decades that the Titanic wasn't popular. It didn't seem like it was much interest or popularity, the Titanic. And I don't feel like no one really covers that type of topic. And so forth. That's all I got to say on the subject. That's another view by Chase Pounds. Stay tuned for my next video. However, one is Chase Pounds. Two things I forgot to mention in my on my subject on the 50th anniversary of the Titanic was that I also mentioned that Irwin Allen. Forgot to mention that Irwin Allen had directed a made-for-TV movie, it's not very known about. It was called In Memory of Eva Walker, that starred the late Natalie Wood. This was just made, I think, a year just before a tragic death. And it was based off of the made-for-TV movie was based off a book from 1978, and it was loosely based off the story of the Titanic. It makes reference that in 1962, of the 50th anniversary, that the wreck was supposedly discovered, and this is in the realm of the book. But of course, it's fictitious, but it was loosely based off the story of the Titanic in the book, but in the film version, it was altered and set during World War II, and the ship sinks to a naval torpedo. It was the victim of the war, the battle of the war. The events and other elements of the movie was changed. It was probably changed, I guess. But it was another movie that reflected Irving Allen's interest in the disaster in many of his film works. And another thing I forgot to mention was that in 1963, the Titanic Historical Society was established the following year. It made me think about Walter Lord, who was being interviewed, saying that when he was writing his book, A Night to Remember, that there was no Titanic Club or any Titanic interest, but just a year as the 50th anniversary, the Titanic Historical Society was set up. That's another thing I felt I left out. That's all I had to say in this interview by Chase Pound. Stay tuned for my next video.